Without further ado, I'd actually like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Karen Quigley from Northeastern University.
Good morning. Thank you to everybody who's showing up for an 8 a.m. session. That's terrific. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what we know about resilience. And I'm going to suggest that you think about your career like a marathon. And we in Boston know lots about marathons, and we know a lot about resilience after marathons and before marathons. And I think if you think about your career as a marathon and about the multiple finish lines that you'll have to hit, the multiple tapes that you will run through across your career, it's useful to give you a bit of a broader view. The science, I was asked to talk a little bit about the science of resilience, and I'm going to give you kind of a very broad overview of some of the science where it really meets, where biology meets psychology, actually. And for psychologists that we typically define resilience, there are 50,000 different definitions, but this is a fairly good one. The idea that it is a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, in face of trauma, tragedy, threats, or even just significant sources of stress. And there are some aspects of our lives where we don't have a lot of control over those things, like childhood adversity. It turns out childhood adversity plays a role in your resilience over your lifespan. But I'm going to focus here on the things that we can control, because I think those are helpful for us. So I'm going to talk about good behavioral habits that are particularly likely to enhance your resilience and your resistance in the face of the kinds of adversities that we all face in our professional lives. So yes, what your parents always told you turned out to be true. Namely, there are some basic health habits that help you weather the slings and arrows of life, from a rejected paper to that experiment that doesn't work, to that colleague who says a snarky comment in the hallway. First of all, your parents told you stay active, do exercise, sleep well, eat a healthy diet, and do work that you love. Okay, and I'm going to suggest to you that those are the primary behavioral habits that will put you in the sort of best position to do well over the entire course of your life, and that includes your professional life. So let's think a little bit about being active. So we know that exercise can regulate mood, improve cognitive function, particularly in older adults. That's been demonstrated. We know it can improve sleep. We know that it can reduce inflammation. And inflammation turns out to be a factor that many of you probably study and know a lot about. And that's one of the sources of a lot of these behavioral things that I'm telling you about seem to have an impact in terms of if you don't do them, if you don't do these healthy habits, inflammation, chronic inflammation goes up. And over the lifespan, that turns out not to be so good. Now, another piece of exercise, which I won't get to say too much about, is sedentarity, which is becoming a much more important issue these days. And it's typically defined as excessive inactivity. It's not really the same thing as a lack of aerobic exercise. It's the problem that all of us have who either sit at a wet bench or sit at our computer all day and don't move our tush off the chair, right? And that's an important problem. So sedentarity, at least in the literature, is measured either as sitting time. It's often also screen time. So be that in front of a computer, a video game, or a television, all right? None of those things turn out to be particularly good. And these days, we can measure it using accelerometry. It's been done measuring it in adolescents. These things, in epidemiological studies, turns out men with sedentary occupations are at higher risk for cardiovascular events, for example. That is just one of the sort of many things. And sedentarity is becoming a much more interesting topic, and I think is going to be important in the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to be something a lot of people are going to be thinking about. Now, the other thing we have to do is improve the extent to which we do exercise. And what does the science about that say? Well, first of all, we know that we know that exercise can reduce mood, or improve mood, rather. And the way it's usually measured is by reducing symptoms of depression and anxiety. So, for instance, a walking program, this was in some older women, improved mood symptoms when it was combined with social support. And exercise manipulations don't have to be like getting on the treadmill or the erg or whatever the sorts of things are that you do in the gym, but it can be as simple as walking. It could also be as simple as doing things like hatha yoga or African dance. There is in fact a study that talks about using these very, very different kinds of things in a randomized controlled trial, showing that they decrease perceived stress and decrease negative affect. Now, it also turns out that exercise can improve cognitive function. So in older individuals, fitness training, and again in randomized controlled trials, has been shown to enhance cognitive performance, especially executive function tasks. So these are the kinds of tasks that are critically important for us as scientists, right? We have to be able to plan, we have to be able to do the sorts of complex cognitive tasks that are required for our work. And it turns out that's one of the places where fitness, at least in older adults, has an impact, and it may well be true for younger adults, although that has been less studied. The other thing exercise does is make you sleep better. Okay, and it turns out there's a lot of interactions going on with these behavioral factors, right? You don't do one of them, and sometimes a bunch of other things spiral down. So one of the things that sleep can do, or rather that exercise can do, is improve your sleep. This has been shown most strongly in epidemiological studies, but there are a few experimental studies where you can see some effects, and they tend to be a little bit more modest or a bit more some studies show the effect, some studies don't. But at least in epidemiological studies, we certainly see this effect. Here's one example study. Japanese study of more than 3,000 people showed that those who had no habitual exercise, reported no habitual exercise, had an odds ratio of 1.3 for insomnia. So the reference would be the odds ratio of 1. And just to give you kind of a comparison point, when they reported stress, the odds ratio was 1.8, and when they were unemployed, the odds ratio was 1.2. Okay, so basically exercise had at least as important an effect as being unemployed. You can look at it that way. What about sleep? So sleep turns out to be one of those features of life that has been somewhat understudied, I would say. But it's a critically important one, and we do know quite a bit about how to treat insomnia or sleep disturbance. So one of the things that's important about this, and these are the kinds of things that we as academics do wrong all the time, okay? And if you can possibly get into the habit of doing them the right way, it can help. One of them is go to bed only when you're sleepy. That's not usually a problem for most of us. But get out of bed if you're not sleeping. Okay, one of the treatments for insomnia is basically if you're in bed for more than about 20 minutes, get up, go do something else. Now, don't do what I do, which is get up and go work at my computer, right? Get up and go do something quiet, right? It might be mindless television. Even better is a book that you've really wanted to read and you can't. And then once you find yourself getting sleepy, go back to bed. Use the bed in the bedroom only for sleeping. How many of us read our emails, use our computers, etc., on our beds? That's a no-no, right? Bed and bedroom are to be kept only for sleeping. And perhaps one other interesting activity, which is perfectly fine to do. And good for your health, by the way. And the final thing is no napping, okay? I don't know if you're a napper. I happen not to be a napper, but that turns out to be one of the things that can really hurt your sleep. So if possible, try to learn not to do that. The last thing that I'll say a little bit about is that there's some kind of really simple stimulus control kinds of things that have to do with your sleeping environment. If you're in a noisy place, that can be hard on your sleep. You can get a lot of micro-arousals during the night. You may not even necessarily know that you're waking, but you're kind of getting these times where you're coming closer to waking than deeper sleep, and that's not necessarily good. Limit your caffeine. I'm speaking to a room full of scientists. How many of you have done this, right? Don't do it. I could drink coffee up until midnight when I went to bed as a graduate student. Can't do that anymore. Your physiology sometimes kind of pushes you to do better habits as you get older. But some of it, you have to just kind of learn to not do it. Keep your room cool and quiet, all right? Turns out cool rooms are much better for sleeping. And then the final thing is that relaxation tools can be incredibly helpful. There are things like doing meditation, etc., and they can sometimes help you clear your mind enough to help you sleep. And what do we know about the science? So sleep can enhance mood, and the other thing that's really critical here is that you might think that depression leads to sleep disturbance, which it turns out it does. But as importantly, newer studies have suggested that the reverse is also true. Poor sleep, sleep disturbance, can be prodromal to and lead to or precipitate a depression. Okay, so it is very, very critical to mood in ways that we sometimes don't really realize. This same effect has been shown in terms of PTSD in a military sample. Objectively, short sleep duration has been related to increased distress Altered hormones related to appetite, so decreased leptin, increased ghrelin, increased BMI. Okay, people are more hungry, so then they're not regulating food intake as well. And increased risk of all sorts of inflammatory related diseases like obesity, hypertension, etc. Healthy diet. Eat lots of vegetables and fruits. Okay, this is one of those other habits that are hard to deal with sometimes, but is an important one. So the basic idea here is that what the studies are suggesting, vegetables and fruit, good, red meat, not so good, fish, also pretty good, and whole grains. Okay, and it's not just the whole grains are giving you fiber, which is one of the main things, but there's a lot of other things in those whole grains that are critically important. And one of the things that's important about all of these is the sort of extent to which they're related to inflammation. So inflammation is promoted by diets that have a lot of refined starches and sugars, saturated in trans fats, and few omega-3 fatty acids, and very little fiber. So steer away from those kinds of things. And so here's a couple of little tidbits. So those who eat more fish have lower levels of depression, again from epidemiological studies, so not perfect kinds of studies, but stress can also increase inflammation and interact with poor diet. So one of the things we know is that people snack more after major stressors, and they tend to snack on the wrong things. They choose high-fat foods, right? And so there's an interesting study showing that men who were divorced, their dietary habits sort of plummeted when they were divorced, and then they remarried and their dietary habits go back up. It tells you something about the importance of social support and the environment that you're in, right? When you're with people who are helping you to eat healthy, you eat healthier. Do that for your friends and colleagues, okay? On to doing work that we love and with people you like. Now, some of this you have control over and some of it you don't. Whoever's in the lab might not be under your control, but I would submit that good mentors tend to take input from their students and their postdocs about incoming people to the lab and sort of to what extent are they going to encourage good things to happen in the lab and be a good environment for the other people in the lab. Think of your work group as a team. And the other thing is to choose work that interests and excites you, because you're going to spend a lot of time doing it, right? And what you sort of already are realizing is that you you start graduate school and immediately there's this stressor and that stressor, and they start with papers and then they go to grants and they change. And so the stressors don't stop. They just change in terms of the nature of them. And the other thing that changes is that you get better at sort of having them come at you and dealing with them and seeing that you were successful at dealing with them. Okay. But early on, I think it's important to make sure that you're doing that thing that really excites you, because that's what's going to hold you over in the long haul. The other thing is to ensure that you have a social support network. Once you have your own lab, foster a team that respects, encourages, and supports one another. Okay? You, as the head of the lab someday, set the tone. And the morale in your lab group is critically important to you all being able to do good, creative, interesting work and to be able to persist through adversity. Now, humans are social beings, and it's sort of a funny thing to say in front of a group of people, many of whom probably sit at a wet bench all day and might not talk to another person. But we are social beings, and there's a certain extent to which, even as a wet bench scientist, you need to make sure you're staying connected to your social network. We know that one of the things that's hard for resilience, or that reduces resilience, is social isolation. Having sort of few social connections make it harder to get out of or get unstuck from adversity. One of the things that I learned from another faculty member, a more senior faculty member when I was in my first faculty job, was the idea of a morale folder. So when you're in that pre-tenure days and it feels like things are just coming at you and you just sort of can't even react fast enough, and she said, set up a morale folder. Every time you get a really great letter from somebody who tells you what a good job you did, every time you hear from a student and they send you an email about what a good teacher you are, every time you get any little tidbit, print it off. I know I'm old, but print it off, stick it in a folder. You can put it on a folder on your desktop too. Just have it there, and when there's those things that come along that are really difficult to deal with, basically go pull that folder out, okay? Use it as a source of your own social support in the moment that you need it. It's been a really, and interestingly enough, I found eventually I didn't need the folder anymore, but it was super helpful as a junior faculty member. one of the things that's important about support is it gives you a fresh perspective. And the other thing that can be really critically important is confirming when what you're feeling is normative. Can you believe that guy just said that in the hall to me, right? The person who said to my colleague one time, but you're a mom and you have little kids. Why are you here in the lab this time of the night? And of course, all the female faculty said, of course that he was being a jerk. That was, of course, the stupidest thing possible to say. And basically, we're able to sort of buffer the effect of that really entirely insensitive comment on her well-being, because the rest of us basically said, yes, you're right to be upset. And that was a normatively distressing event. And the other thing, of course, is your social network is your source of ideas in addition. And so this is an important piece to keep doing. Different networks that you belong to also play a role in your different identities and supporting your different identities. So you have identity, or at least I do, and I'm pretty sure everybody in this room has a very strong identity as a scientist, okay? And so one of the things you need to do is make sure that one of your social support networks supports that identity, okay? But many of us also have other roles we play. I'm a parent of a 9-year-old, and one of my strong other identities is as a parent. So sometimes I need to have a social support network that supports me in that identity as well, right? There are other things. We're children, we are friends, we volunteer for organizations that mean a lot to us. Pick the things that you most value, and of course we're very busy people, so you have to kind of make sure you're being careful about the number of different things that you're doing. But when you choose to do them and you value them, be supported in doing that and make sure you have a network that's going to help you do that. Now I'm going to say a little bit more about the science of resilience, and I'm going to show you some data that I think is really helpful in terms of saying why it's important to follow all these health habits that I just suggested to you. So this is some interesting work by a colleague of mine, George Bonanno, who has for quite a few years studied trajectories of resilience in individuals typically who've been exposed to what he would call potentially traumatic events, okay? And some of the things that you're going to deal with in your career don't meet the criteria of traumatic events, but I'm going to sort of suggest that there's some interesting findings here that I think are relevant even for these kind of lower level stressors. So what these trajectories show, let's see if I've got, yeah, is that there's typically one trajectory where there's some sort of traumatic or potentially traumatic event where basically functioning gets worse. Okay, so this is a kind of a strange slide in that functioning or something being bad is going up and better functioning is coming down. Where functioning turns out to go up and be be poor for a while, and then it drops back and comes back into its normal pattern, right? This is considered the resilience pattern. And you notice right here, the percent of people who have a more resilient pattern are 35 to 55% of the population, even after being exposed to a traumatic or a potentially traumatic event. There is also a group of people whose functioning doesn't start as well, and even some of them come down into the resilient range, another 15 to 35%. And then you do have these two groups of people who are tending to have chronic problems and have poor resilience, okay? But take this into account across a whole set of studies. Here's another study showing very similar idea. This group down here is 83% of the sample. This is a military sample. This is actually a prospective study using a very large cohort called the Millennium Cohort. George managed to get his hands on some of the data from the Millennium Cohort and show that these people also have a resilience trajectory. These are people who have deployed to war. And their trajectory, 83% of them come back and basically have relatively low symptoms scores on a PTSD measure, which is basically a behavioral measure of the kinds of symptoms that people show when they have post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so even at that level, and with that level of kind of exposure, many individuals do well. The other thing you notice is that here's the recovery group again. There are a few people who basically do have pretty decent function to begin with, but then go up, right? These are the ones that the VA, which is part of my job, I actually work in the Department of Veterans Affairs, this is one of the groups that we have to help and work with. But as you can see, that the majority of people are actually doing pretty well. Now, this is a group that is, let me just check what group this is. This is the women who had just had breast cancer surgery. And this group, no, I'm sorry, this is the breast cancer surgery group. This is a spinal cord injury group. And so basically what you can see is you can constantly get this resilient group, 66% of the sample here, roughly 51% of the sample here, okay? These are the resilient folks, and they're always, always the majority of the sample, almost no matter how significant the stressor is. 2 take-home messages. Most people are resilient in the face even of extreme stressors. This I submit to you as being an important thing to keep in mind when things don't go so well in the lab. Keep in mind that you will be okay. Okay? In general, you will be okay. Now, the downside of it is there, of course, are that small proportion of people whose functioning isn't so good beforehand, and they're the ones who are more at risk for not being so okay. So the reason that I sort of pushed so hard on those behavioral things to do, eat right, sleep right, exercise, and to do the work that you love with people that you like, is that those are the ways in which you are going to be one of the resilient people, right? Your functioning is going to be optimized all the time so that when those things come at you, you can deal with them. So here's what I would leave you with as far as your career marathon. Maintain good health habits to optimize your function. Stay active, rested, fed, well-fed with the right kind of food, and establish a supportive network. If you don't love your work, think about why that is and change what's preventing you from loving it. Sometimes it's changing a topic area, sometimes it's changing the setting in which you're doing the work, right? There are ways to address that. And then if you possibly can have some control over it, work with people that you like. Seek out support and encouragement from your mentors, your family, your friends, and peers whom you trust. That can include senior faculty members in other areas who sometimes can provide you with a very useful distance on the problem that you're facing, right? So that you can go to them and say, why am I having this? How do I deal with this, right? They can be incredibly helpful. I suggest that you try to hunt out those kind of people who can help you figure your way through. And with that, I've said my piece, so there's now time for questions.